American women unfortunately fell into the hands of the Native Americans. Despite their desperate pleas, the Native Americans killed them one by one. Unlike the others, the last woman showed no fear and even raised her neck willingly. The Native American chief blew his whistle, signaling his men to spare the woman's life. To test if the woman was truly not afraid of death, Red Feather personally pressed a knife against her neck. There was indeed no fear in the woman's eyes. Red Feather decided to spare her life, perhaps to use her for reproduction. Many American settlers came to America, and a man named Bridger built a station on the frontier, calling it Bridger Fort. This place was a mix of settlers and Native Americans who lived outside the fort, trying to make a living. One day, a mother and son arrived at Bridger Fort, wanting to cross the Yuga region to join the boy's father in Crooks. They needed an experienced guide, and this mother and son were the protagonists of this story. The mother's name was Sarah, and the son's name was Devin. Bridger immediately took Sarah and found a local man named Reed. However, faced with Sarah's high offer of $750, Reed's attitude was unusually firm. He believed that crossing Yuga was too risky and refused. After returning to the station, Bridger recommended a caravan led by a man named Jacob. Jacob and his wife Abish were also important characters in this story. The kind couple decided to help Sarah, and the departure was set for the next morning. Their conversation was overheard by a man. That evening, a drunken Native American man returned to his tent outside Bridger Fort. His wife invited him into bed, but he directly refused. Then, he climbed onto his daughter. When the daughter woke up, she began to struggle. She had had enough of her father's abuse. So, during the day, she secretly snuck into the fort and stole a small knife to prepare for this moment. To ensure nothing went wrong, the girl rushed forward and stabbed her father a few more times until he was completely dead. She ran out of the tent and started running into the distance. The next day, Jacob's caravan set out, and Sarah followed with her son. Reed also arrived on horseback. He couldn't resist the high offer of $750, but by then, Sarah no longer needed him. But no one knew what would happen on the way, so he decided to follow and see what happened. After traveling for half a day, Devin discovered a girl hiding in one of the wagons, and it was the same Native American girl from the previous night. Out of concern for a peer, Devin did not tell his mother about this. Soon, the caravan merged with a larger group of pioneers. There were three forces in America: the Mormons, the government soldiers, and the settlers. The Mormons, recognized as a cult, were driven to this land and formed their own militia. The American government feared their potential rebellion, so they sent soldiers, while the settlers were just ordinary people and adventurers. The Native Americans here were mainly the Utes and some from the Shancheon tribe, with many Utes working for the Mormons. Soon, a few Mormon militiamen found the pioneer group. They brought a command from the Mormon governor, demanding the pioneers turn back and stop advancing. The leader of the pioneer group didn't take this seriously. In his view, the Mormons had no right to enforce laws. His men and firearms were a formidable force, and they weren't afraid of a few Mormon militiamen. The Mormon militia had no choice but to leave. Outside the pioneer camp, Reed had quietly followed and was observing everything from the woods. Meanwhile, a bounty hunter arrived at Bridger Fort. He held a $1,500 reward for Sarah, who had escaped after killing her husband. Bridger didn't reveal Sarah's whereabouts, but this was overheard by Virgil, the man who had eavesdropped on Sarah's conversation the day before. He immediately came up with a bold idea. Elsewhere, the pioneers began dancing around the campfire. They sat together, deepening their bonds, dreaming of their future happiness. Arrows suddenly rained down from all directions, and the camp was thrown into chaos. People scrambled to take cover behind obstacles, but many were still shot down. Some masked riders had charged into the camp, and the leader quickly organized a counterattack. Even if they could kill one or two enemies, they would immediately be killed by other attackers. It was a one-sided capture. Sarah and her son hid under a wagon, and she saw Jacob struggling to fight off the attackers. Suddenly, a masked enemy pounced on him from behind. Jacob struggled while Abish, hearing her husband's cries, rushed from afar. She began dragging the masked man away, but another Native American rushed over and dragged her away. Jacob's tragic situation deeply scared Sarah. Then, she heard a scream to her right, and when she turned, she saw a woman being shot. Next, a father and son were attacked. The father was tackled by a masked man. The masked man realized he had killed a child, and his intense guilt made him sick. He immediately took his mask and began to vomit. Sarah witnessed all of this, unable to believe that the attacker was an American. The hiding wagon was overturned, and the mother and son had to find another place to hide. Fortunately, They managed to hide under their wagon, safe for the moment. The girl, seeing them, decided to abandon this hiding spot and ran out. As she jumped off the wagon, her small knife fell to the ground. Sarah quickly picked it up, gaining some means of self-defense. She too began to run, as staying here meant certain death. If she could make it into the woods, there might still be a chance to survive. At that moment, a masked man noticed the mother and son and immediately drew his gun to shoot, but the shot missed. A cavalryman immediately started chasing them, but just as this happened, a gunman appeared ahead. It was Reed, who had been following them all along. Seeing his comrade killed, the leader quickly ordered a few others to continue the pursuit, emphasizing that no one should be left alive. Soon, four cavalrymen chased them into the woods. Reed worried that continuing to flee would only lead to capture, so he hid in the woods at a bend in the trail. Soon, the pursuers arrived, and Reed raised his pistol, not daring to be careless. Fortunately, the pursuers didn't spot them. Once the sound of hooves faded away, Reed quickly ran in the opposite direction. Meanwhile, back at the pioneer camp, the attackers began executing the wounded, and one of them found a fine pocket watch. He secretly hid it. The surviving women weren't killed, and the attackers decided to send them to their superiors for their enjoyment. The night quickly fell, and Reed and the others arrived at a riverbank, deciding to camp there for the night. Although the temperature was low, they didn't dare to start a fire, fearing the enemy would spot them. Meanwhile, at Bridger Fort, Virgil found the bounty hunter from earlier and told him that he knew where Sarah had gone. He invited the bounty hunter and his team to join the pursuit. Once the task was completed, his team would only need $500, and the bounty hunter agreed. The group immediately set out, but as soon as they left the tavern, Virgil killed the bounty hunter, planning to keep the $1,500 reward for himself. A group of Native American children arrived at the battlefield, scavenging. The ground was littered with dead Americans. A little girl spotted a pair of shoes on a corpse and immediately began to take them, but as soon as she touched the body, she realized the dead man seemed to have come back to life. Terrified, she ran away, and the resurrected man scared all the Native American children. They dropped their things and fled. Jacob stood frozen, unable to believe his comrades had turned into corpses. The day before, Jacob had been subdued by an attacker, and his scalp had been gruesomely peeled open. Fortunately, he had fallen face down, and his injured scalp had healed enough to prevent him from bleeding out. When Jacob regained consciousness, he began searching for his wife's body. Fortunately, he couldn't find her anywhere in the camp, which meant there was a chance she was still alive. At that moment, he saw a group of riders approaching from a distance. When they got closer, he realized they were 6 Native Americans. He immediately knelt down with his hands clasped together, begging the Native Americans to help him find his wife. But the Native Americans didn't understand his language. The man speaking was Red Feather, a Native American leader resisting the American invaders. Because Jacob looked like he was suffering more than death, Red Feather decided to spare his life, perhaps out of a sense of gentle mercy. On the other side, Reed was preparing to take Sarah and her son on a detour back to Bridger Fort. After witnessing the slaughter the previous day, he believed that returning was the wisest choice. Sarah disagreed, so he dragged Devon onto his horse, forcing Sarah to follow alone. However, he didn't know that Sarah had a $1,500 bounty on her head, and returning would mean certain death. Reed spoke a few words in Native American, and Sarah looked back and saw the mute Native American woman from earlier. In this world of cannibalism, Reed didn't trust any strangers, so the mute woman had to turn around and leave. Soon, they arrived at a canyon. Because the river was too rough, Reed decided to check if there was a better place to cross nearby. Sarah and Devon were left behind. Now, he helps the mother and son more out of kindness. If Sarah still stubbornly wants to find death, he doesn't care anymore. Just as Reed had left, the mute Indian woman found the mother and son. The mute woman meant no harm. She just wanted to retrieve her lost knife. At that moment, a horse neigh was heard from across, and it was Virgil and his bounty hunter team. Sarah realized that this group was after her bounty, so she immediately ran back with her son. Virgil fired 2 shots, but they missed due to the distance. Not far from there, Reed heard the gunshots and hurried to the cliff to observe the river but saw no abnormalities. Just turned to get back on his horse, he heard some strange noises ahead. He held his breath and started observing, eventually focusing on a patch of bushes. The bushes were too dense for him to see what was hidden inside, but he heard a faint sound, like a bowstring being pulled tight. Reed quickly dodged to the side, but the arrow struck his thigh as he fell off the horse. He hurriedly got up, grabbed the rifle from his saddle, and realized he was being targeted by the Native Americans. Not knowing how many enemies there were, he could only keep dodging the arrows using serpentine movements. The priority was to find an open area to avoid being ambushed. Meanwhile, during Reed's escape, Sarah and the others kept running through the woods. Exhausted, they hid in a cave. Virgil's team appeared not far away. One of the men claimed to have seen the three enter the cave, so Virgil sent him inside to check. It was too dark in the cave, so the man had to light a match for illumination, but he was immediately killed by the mute woman. She picked up the man's rifle and began shooting outside. She guarded the cave entrance, signaling Sarah to move further inside to check for another exit. The people outside didn't dare to rush in. They gathered dry grass from around to set it on fire. The thick smoke quickly spread inside the cave, but by a stroke of luck, Sarah found an exit at the end of the cave. As the smoke began to clear, Virgil chased in but found that Sarah and the others had already escaped and disappeared without a trace. On the other side, Reed finally reached the center of the grassland, an excellent place to fight the enemies. He snapped off the arrow tip lodged in his leg, and a Native American with an axe appeared. Taking a fighting stance, Reed gritted his teeth, pulled the arrow from his leg, but didn't use his gun, as it would attract more Native Americans. The opposing Native Americans seemed to read Reed's intentions, howled, and prepared to attack. Calling his nearby comrades, Reed quickly crouched and rammed into the opponent, not giving him a chance to swing his axe, then slammed the rifle butt down, killing him. However, another native archer arrived, and Reed had to keep running. Soon, he entered the woods, but ahead was a cliff. No way to retreat. The archer had caught up, and the arrow narrowly missed him. Reed decisively launched a counterattack, once again slamming into the archer, but this archer was agile, and just as he was knocked down, another native warrior charged at Reed. Caught off guard, Reed was knocked down the hill, and his rifle fell aside. The two quickly recovered from the impact. The native warrior pulled out his axe, and Reed prepared for battle. These Native Americans were likely the ones who attacked the settlers the day before. They served the Mormons and had been relentlessly chasing Reed and Sarah. Reed realized there was no room for leniency. He firmly suppressed the opponent's right hand holding the axe and threw heavy punches. However, the native warrior exploded with incredible strength, pushing Reed away and charging at him. Reed, seeing this, used the momentum to redirect the force, sending the warrior into the river. The warrior fell hard, and his axe dropped. He struggled to climb ashore, but Reed quickly took hold of him from behind, grabbed a stone, and finished him off. Meanwhile, another native warrior, Red Feather, was burning with anger. He learned that some Paiute tribe members had joined the Mormons for cattle and women, so he immediately shot the Paiute chief. His men quickly surrounded and executed the remaining traitors. The wolf pack, known as the Wild Wolves, vowed to resist the Americans to the death and would never tolerate betrayal from their own people. This scene terrified the 6 captured American women, who begged for their lives. But the Wild Wolves showed no mercy. However, unlike the others who panicked, Abish remained extraordinarily calm and even raised her chin, staring directly at Red Feather. This calmness intrigued Red Feather, and he decided to take Abish back to the tribe, believing she might bear him a strong heir. The next day, Abish's husband, Jacob, tracked them down and eventually reached this place. As a Mormon, he received assistance from the local Mormon militia. However, he didn't know that it was these same Mormons who had orchestrated the horrific massacre the day before. Their true intention in assisting Jacob was to ensure there were no survivors. Soon, Jacob found severed ropes on a wagon, confirming that his wife was still alive. At that moment, they discovered a dying Indian man who had been shot by Red Feather the day before. Jacob hurriedly approached and asked him what had happened. The Indian man weakly pointed towards the wolf pack, indicating they were the masterminds behind the massacre, and looked at the 2 Mormon officers, hoping they would help him. However, the officers, fearing exposure, shot the Indian man dead. Jacob, stunned, asked the officers why they killed him, to which they calmly replied, "We've learned enough. Since it was the wolf pack, I was just sending this Indian off humanitarian." This explanation was flawless, and Jacob had no choice but to leave angrily. Later, one officer whispered to the other, "Abish must die, and if necessary, we'll kill Jacob too." This mission, which appeared to be a rescue, was in fact a pursuit. Meanwhile, U.S. government troops arrived at the massacre site. The captain noticed something off in the traces of battle and suspected that the Mormons were behind the massacre. After all, no Native American would wear a headdress while killing. The captain decided to contact the local Native Americans for further investigation. On the other hand, Sarah and her son continued heading west, and Sarah had learned the Indian girl's name 2 Moons. That night, they camped by the river to fend off the cold. They lit a bonfire, unaware of the danger it posed. As they slept, a man quietly approached. Luckily, the newcomer was not a pursuer but Reed. He quickly put out the fire and urged them to move on quickly to avoid being detected by the enemy. While traveling, the creaking sound of Devon's leg brace was especially loud in the quiet night. Reed promptly removed the brace and warned, "Stop making noise." It was a quiet night. The next morning, they discovered a slaughterhouse at the foot of the mountain, with many horses inside. Reed decided to buy a few horses to speed up their journey, but unfortunately, he had no money. Sarah reluctantly took out $100, saying that it was all she had. Reed instructed the 3 to stay put while he went to buy the horses. However, just as the deal was about to be made, Sarah ran up to ask if the price was settled. The butcher immediately became suspicious and asked Sarah if she was still carrying a small boy. Sarah froze in place, and Reed gave her a meaningful look. It turned out that Virgil had been here earlier, claiming he was hunting for a mother and son duo with a bounty, and his description of the mother almost perfectly matched Sarah. Then the butcher noticed a small figure on the hill in the distance, which heightened his suspicion. While Sarah and her son remained unaware of the danger and lacked crisis awareness, Reed sighed inwardly, feeling that he couldn't rely on these 2 baggage carriers, and that the mute Indian woman was far more alert than them. Reed calmly said to the butcher, "Since you don't want to do business, we'll leave." But the butcher wasn't about to let this prize slip away. He immediately called his men to grab weapons and prepare to attack. However, Reed was prepared. He quickly drew a handgun from his sleeve and fired first. By the time he killed the 3rd man, he was shot in the waist, but Reed unleashed incredible combat strength, grabbed an axe from the ground, and killed the 4th man, then accurately threw the axe to deal with the 5th man. The battle finally ended, and the last survivor was the female butcher, who was also the leader of this group. After the fight, Reed was utterly furious. He hadn't realized that Sarah was carrying a bounty on her head and finally understood why she had refused to comply with his arrangements. Sarah realized that Reed might no longer help her, so she quickly took out a large sum $500. It turned out she had been hiding this money, which matched exactly the amount on the bounty. Perhaps this was the ransom she had prepared in case she was hunted by bounty hunters. One had to admit, Sarah was clever, and Reed finally got the reward he deserved. Originally, Sarah had offered $750, with only $100 up front, but now she paid $1,500 in full. Since he'd been paid, Reed agreed to escort them to Crooks instead of Bridger Fort. However, Reed was seriously wounded during the battle. He needed medical attention immediately, or his chances of survival would be slim. Thus, he decided to head towards the Shoshone tribe for help. However, after traveling some distance, he passed out due to excessive blood loss and fell off his horse. Sarah approached to check his injuries and found the situation to be worse than she had imagined. Her first reaction was to take back the $1,500, which stunned Devon, leaving him unsure of how to react to her. Next, Sarah began to tend to Reed's wounds. She went to the riverbank to clean the cloth, but suddenly noticed an Indian standing across the river. Panicked, she quickly ran back to the camp, only to discover that her son had been captured by the Indians. Fortunately, the Indians had no ill intent. They placed Reed on a horse and took him back to their tribe for treatment. In the tribe, the doctor revealed a secret. Reed had been sent to the Shoshone tribe when he was a child, where he grew up before leaving for some unknown reason. Soon, Reed regained consciousness, and the tribe's people affectionately called him by his real name. He went to the tent of the female chief, who was his adoptive mother. His biological brother, to his surprise, was the leader of the Indian wolf pack Red Feather. Red Feather had long left the Shoshone tribe and founded his own tribe. At the same time, a U.S. government military unit arrived. They learned from Reed that the people who attacked the pioneers were likely Mormon militia. The captain finally obtained a crucial lead. If they gathered more evidence, they could rightfully exterminate the Mormons. After the government troops left, Reed continued his journey with Sarah and her son. The mute Indian girl, 2 Moons, chose to accompany them, as she considered Sarah and her son to be friends. Meanwhile, the Mormon militia was still tracking Sarah. The officer had assumed that Sarah and her son had been dealt with, but to his surprise, they were still alive. He immediately used the excuse of tracking Red Feather to send the officer and Jacob to join Virgil's team, secretly assigning a covert mission to the officer. As the story progressed, the situation became more complicated. In the wilderness, a little girl holding a doll suddenly appeared, which immediately caught Sarah's attention. Reed was worried it might be a trap and advised her not to get involved, urging her to leave quickly, but Sarah insisted on returning the girl home, and Reed had no choice but to accompany her. Just as they entered the valley, they were ambushed by a group of armed bandits. Of the four, only the mute Indian girl managed to escape. While Sarah paid a painful price for her impulsiveness, she was dragged into a small dark room and subjected to abuse. For the following days, she would endure such torment. One night, another deformed man came to torment her again, but fortunately, the mute girl burst in and knocked him down. Sarah seized the gun and killed the beasts, leaving only an old man and the little girl alive. A few days later, Virgil's bounty hunters tracked them down and confirmed Sarah's whereabouts, taking the little girl's doll along the way. Meanwhile, Red Feather arrived at the government troops' camp with Abish. Upon learning that she was a survivor of the massacre at the meadow, the captain immediately took her to the Mormon militia station. Abish recognized the perpetrators instantly but didn't expose them right away. Instead, she waited until they had left before telling the captain the truth. The captain quickly wrote a letter to his superior, requesting reinforcements. However, his deputy was an insider for the Mormon militia and passed the letter directly to the militia commander. Bill realized the plot was exposed and immediately mobilized the Mormon militia, preparing to wipe out the government troops to prevent the news from leaking. Meanwhile, Abish didn't trust the government troops either. She decided to leave on horseback and join the Indian tribe. Soon after, the Mormon militia launched an attack, wiping out the government troops, and the remaining deputy was also eliminated. Upon hearing the news, Red Feather called upon the entire Shoshone tribe to fight back. Meanwhile, Virgil's team was still tracking Sarah, and Jacob found the officer's watch, which had once belonged to his cousin. He immediately understood that the officer was one of the perpetrators of the massacre and seized the opportunity to kill him, but was abandoned by Virgil's team afterward. He eventually returned to the Mormon militia, suspecting that they were the true culprits behind the massacre but never revealing that he had killed the officer. Soon after, the Mormon militia officially attacked the Shoshone tribe. Red Feather died in battle, and his family did not survive either. The entire Shoshone tribe was wiped out. Meanwhile, Reed and the others continued their journey west. Along the way, Devon's horse suddenly got spooked and threw him off, and Reed had to shoot the horse to end its suffering. Eventually, they found an abandoned house to rest, but Virgil's team followed them there. After a fierce battle, Reed successfully wiped out the bounty hunters, but Virgil's brother managed to escape. Not long after, Sarah was kidnapped by Virgil's brother. Reed successfully rescued her, but he was severely injured and would not survive. Throughout their journey together, Reed and Sarah had developed feelings for each other, but this love could only remain a regret in the end. I'm a movie enthusiast. Please subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you next time.